The Russian invasion of Ukraine can be described in many ways. Pointless, barbaric, idiotic, cruel, or just downright ignorant are a few choice phrases that spring to mind. But a new descriptor will soon have to be added to the list: suicidal. You see, the repercussions of Putin's invasion have created the perfect storm for the Russia that Putin has so meticulously crafted over the decades to crumble and perish right before his eyes. In the end, it's all thanks to Putin that, in 2023, we really might be witnessing the death throes of a once powerful country. Here's why. When Putin took control of Russia in 2000, he knew the country was far from being the powerhouse it was during the Soviet era. To avoid being drowned out by the growing might of the US, EU, and rapidly expanding stronghold of China, he understood that Russia needed leverage over them. This mob-like thinking was entrenched in him, burned into his core by his KGB days sulking around East Germany. Putin's point of entry for this racketeering scheme was obvious: energy. Russia has a wealth of fossil fuel resources, not to mention vast nuclear infrastructure left over from the Soviet period. So he set to work making Russian oil, gas, and nuclear enrichment a cornerstone of Western life. Over the decades, the West grew accustomed to and eventually became dependent on Russia's oily teat for their power needs. For example, prior to the Ukraine war in 2021, the EU acquired 83% of its natural gas from Russia. In 2021, 30% of the oil used in the EU came from Russia. Globally, 35% of all nuclear enrichment, the process of making raw uranium a usable nuclear fuel, is currently undertaken by Russia. In theory, this gave Russia immense power over the international scene. No one would dare impose crippling sanctions on Russia or threaten its military expansion as, in return, Russia could then pull the plug on their fossil fuel and nuclear exports and crash the West's energy grids, causing widespread turmoil. Because of this fear, Russia felt comfortable instigating an aggressive invasion of Ukraine, assuming that the West would be too dependent on Russian oil to risk the consequences that would come with supporting Ukraine. They thought they could be as brutal as they liked and suffer almost no repercussions. But what Putin failed to consider was that this dependence isn't one-sided. Yes, the West is heavily dependent on Russian oil and nuclear fuel, but equally, if not more so, the Russian economy relies on these exports. The EU buys 50% of Russia's exports, which are, as we stated earlier, mainly oil, gas, and nuclear fuel. Because the Kremlin controls almost all of Russia's internal oil companies, oil exports account for 50% of their annual revenue. Russia's oil and gas industry accounts for nearly 20% of its annual GDP, making it one of the most heavily oil-dependent economies in the world. In other words, Russia inadvertently set the stage for the West to pull the rug from under it, a task that has been done with brutal effect over the past few months. Recently, the EU started securing natural gas from other sources. Russian gas used to account for 46% of the natural gas used in the EU, but now it only accounts for 9%. A price cap on Russian oil imposed by the G7, which Putin refuses to bow to, means that the West is now also buying oil from other sources, such as OPEC countries, leaving Russian oil without a buyer. Read more here. Even France and the US have kicked off plans to expand their own uranium enrichment sites to wean themselves off Russian-sourced enrichment. There are also reports that renewable energy adaptation has significantly sped up in these countries to combat Russia's influence. A bitterly cold winter was Putin's last bastion against this Western purchasing shift. If the EU struggled to keep the heating on due to sky-high energy prices, it could be enough to make them stop supporting Ukraine and instead go back to using Russian gas and oil once more. But bad news for Putin. Thanks to climate change, this was an incredibly mild winter for Europe. And so the march away from Russia has continued. Where does this leave Russia? Well, the crippling cost of the invasion, which was estimated in November to have cost $82 billion after only 9 months of fighting, combined with the catastrophic blow to their economy and government revenue due to the loss of exports, means that Russia is facing a devastating recession. Think 2008, but on a larger scale and for a decade. However, Russia's suffering doesn't end once they have recovered from the effects of this financial collapse. As we mentioned before, the only way Russia can play a role on the international stage is through its fossil fuel reserves and Soviet-era nuclear infrastructure. Apart from this, their economy and influence are minuscule. But in 10 years, not only will everyone be sourcing oil from elsewhere, the demand for fossil fuel will be at an all-time low, leaving Russia high and dry. Once in this position, Russia will have absolutely no influence beyond its borders. It could disappear into a cloud of smoke, and the rest of the world would struggle to notice. And, unlike last time, Putin and his Russia will have no way of climbing back up to the lofty heights they once enjoyed, given that the latter, that is the fossil fuel industry, won't be there to save them. In other words, Putin's Russia is doomed to be dead and buried very, very soon. What's funny is that if Russia just stayed within its borders, abided by the memoranda it signed, and kept its head down, then Putin would still retain the international influence he spent decades building up. He could have used this power to elevate Russia through the last of the oil money and ensure they set themselves up to prosper throughout the transition away from oil. But no, instead, Putin had to undertake this deranged invasion and send the entire country into a spiraling death dive. I wonder just how much longer the Russian people will let this idiotic, tyrannical leader stick around. After all, as history shows, the Russian people aren't opposed to toppling tyrants.